Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we're going to get into a really fun topic. So this comes from the YouTube video that we posted last week, and it's called A Tale of Two Brains, and it's by this comedian named Mark Gungor. And so I looked up a little bit about Mark Gungor, and he's just one of the most sought after speakers on marriage and relationships in the world today.
He thinks he is.
He thinks he is?
I think he's kind of full of himself, but I'll get it more into that.
Okay. Apparently Mark has some strong opinions.
Yeah.
Mark has some strong opinions of this guy, and I have no idea what they are. So this is going to be a really fun episode, everyone, because Mark's apparently got some opinions. So I do want to say that for over a decade, Mark's materials have been the number one resources for improving relationships used by the U.S. military. I don't know if that sways you at all.
Well, I mean, here's the problem. The military has one of the highest divorce rates. Now, I don't know that has to do with Mark Gungor's stuff.
Right.
It's just that is a very hard context in which to maintain a relationship when you're off on deployment. So I don't mean to make light of that because I think it's hard. It's hard for active military, and we don't need to go much more into that. But it's just tough.
Okay. All right, so if you have watched the video, then you are aware of Mark Gungor's opinion on the difference between men and women's brain. And he has this whole long segment, but I thought it would be fun just to break down just these 5 minutes. And he talks about the difference between men's brain and women's brain, kind of from a structural component. But he uses an analogy, and he does it in a very humorous way, and it's really funny. And so, Mark, now I'm really curious. So you have to tell me, what are your thoughts on this video?
At the start, I think there are differences, and we'll get into those. It's his presentation. Okay. And the reason I want to talk about it, because I'm guessing that some of our listeners are going to have the same reaction that I had. Uh-huh. And so I think what really bothered me is he is really condescending about women and demeaning toward women. And I'll point out 2 things that stand out to me. So he has the 2 busts of the male head and the female head. And he starts with the male head and is talking about it. He walks over to the female head, and do you know what he does? He makes the sign of the cross.
Oh.
Like, oh my gosh, here I am in front of the female head. I've got to protect me. I'm making the sign of the cross. Okay. So that's the first thing. Then later on, I think he's talking about the idea of men and their nothing box. So I think his ideas are fine. I don't like him as a presenter. Okay. So he talks about the men in the nothing box. And whenever he uses a voice for a woman, it's really whiny and nasally.
Okay. I
was really offended by it. And I think that his material could be just as funny if he took that stuff out. Because it's kind of funny anyway, the differences. I mean, if he just went off the differences and talked about it, I think people would laugh. But I think he goes too far, and he makes a caricature mostly of women.
Okay.
And I think it's a stereotype, and he's playing into the stereotype. If I were a female, I wouldn't like it. I don't know if you had any reaction to that part.
I just thought it was funny. I mean, And maybe just because, from a cultural standpoint, I mean, that's very typical stereotype of women. And so
that's true. You're right. And I don't like it. I mean, I don't like the stereotype.
And I can totally understand. And I guess maybe I've developed thick skin against it. Yeah. And in some ways, like overall in general, the way he talks about the female's brain, I absolutely fall into that.
But I agree with that. So I agree with this whole premise.
Yeah.
But we'll talk about.
Right. But I don't think I fall into the category of, nothing drives a woman more crazy than sitting and watching a man do absolutely nothing. I mean,
I think that's true for some women.
I
but
think
that's
it
also,
is.
but that's also true for some men. I've certainly run into men who, if their wife is doing nothing, have a problem with it. So I'm going to leave that behind. I just wanted to say it because I wanted to acknowledge that for some of our listeners, they may have a similar reaction. So we're going to try and just look at the content now, which I think it's interesting content and worth talking about.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think it's good to understand the differences between the way men think and the differences between the way women think. Because,
Oh, yeah, I
I
agree.
mean, that's only going to help you have a better relationship if you can understand where the other person's coming from.
That's right. But there's a next step. It's
Okay.
accepting. It's
Yes.
acceptance. It's acceptance of the differences that we bring to the relationship. And I try and say this to couples every day. It's not that there's a right way and a wrong way as far as
Hmm.
communication. There are different ways. And so, for successful relationships, it's really about acceptance. That's what Harville Hendricks said. The primary task of relationships or marriage is to accept differences.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, outside of common gender roles or the structural difference between men's brain and women's brain,
Right.
people are just different in general. And so in order to
But
have a
right.
good relationship, there's going to be differences. And I think you're right. A key component to a successful, happy relationship in any context is accepting differences and differences of opinions.
Right.
So, next week we're going to get into empathy for our topic. And, I think that's a huge problem in today's world is that we can't accept people's differences. And
I agree with that.
this is a complete aside. So it's important to understand that people are different and it's okay to be different. Like you can be different and you can still get along.
Yes. Couples come in, they sit on the couch and they say, we are so different. And I
Hmm.
try and help them understand that would be the same. Whoever is sitting there, you're not the same person. You're
Yes.
always going to be so different. And
Hmm.
there's nothing wrong with that. And you can have a great marriage being so different.
Yeah.
So let's talk about structure because I think it is interesting, and there is some interesting research out there that does show some structural differences. And when I say structural differences, really the way the neurons are formed and connected. Now, the evidence he cites some evidence, I think, out of University of Pennsylvania, and if I'm remembering this right, that it's along sex hormones, and so in utero, depending on the amount of testosterone or progesterone that is in the woman as she's carrying the baby, then one, it determines the sex of the baby, but it also then changes the formation of the brain. And so it kind of makes sense that
Hmm.
there are going to be some differences. Now, I like everything, I think we've talked about this as far as mental health issues and the way we are in the world. It's a combination of nature and nurture.
Yes.
So it's very much the way we are born and how we're carried in utero, and often the substances that the mother takes in when she's carrying a baby, and so that all goes into the formation of the body and the brain. We aren't going to talk much about that, probably not any more about it, because there's not much you can do about that.
Right.
What you can understand is the component that nurture has.
Yep.
And so, the environment, how we're brought up. And I think tonight, that's really what we're going to focus on more than anything is, the cultural implications, because that's what I would call it, is the cultural way we raise men and women are different. But just to conclude that, there are structural differences between men and women's brains.
Right. And so going back to that cultural thing just a little bit, it starts at a very young age, and
Mm-hmm.
we're definitely getting a little bit more gender fluid in a lot of roles, and especially parents are no longer necessarily labeling toys. These are for boys and these are for girls, which I think is a good thing. I personally am a really big proponent of let kids be into whatever they're into. And as far as why toys tend to be separated, I think it's all just a marketing scheme. I think
Oh,
it's
I
just
agree.
yeah, I think
Right.
it's just easier to sell certain things if they're categorized by gender. But I mean, who cares? I've got two girls and a boy, and my boy is the youngest, and he's 2, and his sisters are older, and so he ends up with nail polish on him quite regularly. And you know what? It's fine. I mean, it's nail polish and he loves the attention. They love doing it. Is it going to be detrimental to him in any way, shape, or form? No, it's not. And my girls have gone through phases where they've loved to play with dinosaurs and cars, and let kids be into whatever it is they're going to be into. I think it's healthy for them to step into either realm of imagination or all imaginations. It's healthy for them.
I agree with you. And so I think the cultural ways we bring up males and females certainly starts at a young age. And I think that there are certainly parents who try to make that less of an issue. I think it's really tough because if you could raise a child, say, in isolation, then I think you could do that. But you would never raise a child in isolation because, they go to preschool or kindergarten and all of the other kids are going to be, acting like boys, acting like girls. I mean, I understand the reasoning behind it. And I agree with you that I think it's a good idea to make toys less gender specific. But so it starts very early, and I think it's in ways that we don't even realize. And once they go off to preschool and school, we lose a lot of control as a parent because you aren't going to be able to control everything that everyone that they interact with. Here's how I think culture influences it. It's the way we raise boys to not really be in touch with their emotions. And again, I think it's a subtle thing. And I think that's changing a lot because as parents become more aware of the importance of being able to access and express various emotions. It's really important, I think, for individual emotional health, but I see it in the context of how damaging it can be in relationship when the child grows up, becomes an adult, then pairs off, gets married. And it's not always this way, but it's often this way. They come in and the wife says, he has no emotion or he has emotion. He's just not, he doesn't know how to share it.
Yeah.
And so I think that video, Mark Gungor,
yeah.
that is, I really believe it. And here's how I explain it. And it's a little bit different than the way he explains it, but it's essentially the same. I think we raise boys to be more linear in their thought process. And when you think about it, that tends to influence the way they think of emotions. And we really, at least in the past, though, when I was growing up, which we're talking 60 years ago when I was 5 and 6, and the idea was boys don't cry.
Right.
And, there are going to be some parents who are still going to say that. And so the message over time is, don't feel your emotions. Don't feel sad. If you're hurt, don't acknowledge it. And that's a pretty strong message. But again, I think it's starting to change.
I agree.
And there are many parents who don't do that, which I think is really wonderful because teach your boys to be able to access their emotions as well. Yeah. But then with the females, it's all about their emotional life and their interaction with their friends. Now, I think there are some brain differences there that leads them also to be more connected or to try to be more connected. And I think that the boys naturally have that more of ability to have that parallel play, which is often what happens when they grow up into men, is that a lot of men interact with each other, what we would call parallel play. It's rare for men to go sit around the campfire and talk about their feelings, but what they do is grab a gun and they go out hunting and get the elk, and that's what they do for fun. But I think we raise males to be very linear and problem solvers, and to have a problem and go to the solution. And so a lot of men grow up thinking that's the right way.
Right.
Which is definitely an issue. And I don't know, in that video I watched, I don't know that he talks about it in that same way. But the way I think about women and the way we raise women is, I think, very similar, because I think of women being brought up in more of a nonlinear process, which he describes it as the wires going all over the place, connected to everything.
Yep.
Which I think is a pretty accurate way to describe it. It's the connection, but if you think about it in terms of its connectedness And I think we raise females to be better at connectedness. And so, they grow up, they get married, and they want to be connected to their husband, and their husband has no idea what that even means.
Yeah.
Granted, I see the couples that are having trouble. So,
right.
I have a bit of a skewed view, but that's what I hear often is my husband has no idea what he's feeling. He's not able to express it. Whereas females, are better able to express their emotions. Now, I think if I remember right, I think there are some differences in the verbal parts of the female brain that really make it easier for them to access and verbalize the emotions. I'm pretty sure that's accurate. So there are those brain differences, but a lot of it is cultural.
Yeah, and I think I would tend to agree. And so real quick, just for any of our listeners who didn't watch the video. So the premise of this 5-minute clip that we're talking about is the difference between men's brain and women. And to simplify it, men are very compartmentalized. They have a box for everything. And it's all separate, and the boxes don't touch. So they're very compartmentalized. So that means when they're at work, they're thinking about work. When they're with their kids, they're thinking about their kids. When they're with their wife, they're thinking about their wife. And it's all separated. Whereas women's brain, it's like wires everywhere, and everything is connected. And that is totally true, I think, in both accounts. And as you were talking, I'm thinking about this study I heard, and I don't even remember where it comes from or who did it, but they recorded young boys and young girls, and they put some sort of recording device on them just to record the sounds that they made all day. And girls tended to talk and babble all day long, and boys tended just to grunt and make a lot of noises, which I mean, sounds very stereotypical, but I mean, you can't really stereotype a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old.
But we do know that females' verbal capacities mature much faster than males. I mean, that's a pretty well-known fact. So, and I think it has to do with brain structure too. Anyway, the word connected. So the men in the boxes and the boxes don't touch.
Yeah.
It's just disconnected, which I think that's what I would term it more a disconnection. And I really don't think there are structural differences that prohibit men from doing that, from having a connection. I think that's entirely cultural.
Yeah.
And so in that way, I may disagree with him. I think I don't know. I can't remember if he talks about the cultural implications. Do you remember? Does he talk about that?
No, he never, at least not in this segment. So there's the 5-minute clip where he talks just about the male's brain and the female's brain. And then there's a little bit longer one that's about 12 to 13 minutes.
And that's the one I watched.
Yes. I don't remember any reference culturally, and I don't know that he's ever gone into that. This is the only thing of his that I've watched is this video. I don't think he ever goes into the culture around it. I mean, I think it's definitely true that there is a cultural component in the way that we raise males and females. And I think one of the most positive changes that I've noticed compared to when I was growing up is the validation of emotions. Mm-hmm. And my parents, I don't think they even knew what that meant or how to validate a kid's emotions. They were more of, just stop crying or, knock it off, and not that they were doing anything wrong. It's just, that was their way of trying to help me. And my mom would, she would kind of be sympathetic, or sometimes she'd be like, yeah, you're overreacting. I think that that's important to talk about, of that culturally. Validating emotions in kids is a big thing.
Well, because we're going to talk more about it next week, because that's the way you teach empathy.
Yeah.
Right. The empathy is, I see your emotion and I understand it, and I can understand the way you're feeling that way. So that is a positive change. Before we leave talking about that video, I don't know that he's implying this. He might be. The implication is that all these differences are due to structural differences in the brain. That is absolutely not true.
Right.
And again, he doesn't come out and explicitly say that, but he leaves out the important part of the cultural influences. And so all these differences that we're talking about are not structural differences in the brain. And I try and help couples understand, and lots of times men understand. I think it's just skill building. It's just learning how to access the emotions. For instance, this is an exercise that I'll do often with men, that we don't teach men to have a very good vocabulary for emotions.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I have this list, and I've never counted them up. There must be 100 different emotion words on this list.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll hand it to them and I'll say, pick one of these words right now. And so they have to scan through these words, and they'll come up with words that they probably never would have thought of. Mm-hmm. So the exercise is read over this list often, because if you increase your vocabulary, you increase the ability to feel the emotion, or to label it anyway.
Yes.
So you're going to feel it, but you're going to label it more accurately. So to have an emotionally intimate relationship with someone, it requires a couple of things. One, it requires the desire to share your emotional state with someone else. Mm-hmm. And secondly, it requires that vocabulary.
Yeah.
In order to be able to share it. And third, it requires a desire to actually share it with someone, or to be self-aware enough to.
And it's amazing what just labeling an emotion can do. I mean, because sometimes, as human beings, we don't know how we're feeling. And mm-hmm. if you can't explain to it, how can you expect someone else to understand? And if they don't understand, how can they sympathize with you? Just being able to label an emotion and to understand why it is you're reacting the way you are, I think can be an incredibly powerful tool in a relationship.
That's what's behind John Gottman's, I've referenced this before, John Gottman's parenting, and he calls it two different things. One is called emotion coaching, mm-hmm. which is all about teaching kids empathy, but he's also called it the heart of parenting. And so if people want to go to Gottman.com and look under the parenting resources, that's exactly what he's doing. He thinks that one of the primary tasks of parents is to help children label the emotion.
Yes, because kids feel these big emotions, but they don't understand it. And that can be incredibly frustrating. I mean, we call it tiny humans having big emotions. Mm-hmm. And that's totally true. And I experience this on a daily basis with my 2-year-old. I mean, he is in this phase where he is very emotionally driven, and there's nothing logical about his wants and needs, but he knows that he has wants and he has needs, and he has no idea how to properly express them, and it creates a lot of frustration. Hence we get the terrible twos. It's our job to help them understand, and I think we can from even a young age, even if just by showing them sympathy when they're really mad. They may not understand all of the words you're using, but if you say, "Oh, are you just so frustrated? Are you just so sad?"
I agree with you. I think you start from a very young age.
Yeah, I think it can have a really positive impact. Not that you have to. You can start from any age, really.
Yeah, you can, but I think there are a lot of parents who are realizing the importance of doing that with their children, mm-hmm. and are starting to do that more consistently.
Yeah. And, at first it feels a little foreign. It feels a little bit like you're being, I don't know, that parent that maybe can sometimes be mocked. But I promise if you keep doing it, it'll feel more natural. It's very natural for me to say to my girls, and, even to my 2-year-old, my son a little bit, but it's very natural for me to say to my girls, I can see that you're feeling this. I can see this emotion that you're going through right now, and help them to be able to maybe better regulate it. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I regularly help my girls with is, I can see you're mad, and it's okay that you're mad. You can be as mad as you want, but the way you are acting is inappropriate.
It's really important what you just said, self-regulation.
Yes.
See, that's, and so I think as parents, that's what we want to teach our children. And the first step is to be able to label it and to say, here, help children figure out, here are your options for behavior around this particular emotion.
Yeah. My girls are probably going to hate the phrase, probably all my kids, actions have consequences, because I say it to them all the time. So they know the way you're acting right now, there's going to be consequences, and you're not going to like them.
Well, that's real world.
Which is exactly what I want them to understand. And probably because I have a sibling who doesn't seem to understand that.
Yeah.
And it can drive everyone in the family crazy. So, it's important to help kids understand from a young age that you don't just get to act out your emotions in inappropriate ways. There's going to be consequences for that.
So can I address one of the things he brought up, which
Sure.
I do disagree with?
Okay.
The nothing box.
Yes. Yes.
I think he's misunderstanding what's going on, because now it's true. I think men have more of an ability to do nothing, but to me, that is different than thinking about nothing,
Okay.
which when you think about it, what I know about the brain is almost impossible to do.
Okay.
Now, there are certainly Buddhist monks who practice meditation with the idea of emptying their mind. And this is a practice that goes on hours every day for years before they can master it. So I think you and I are going to have a very difficult time having nothing in our brain. Here's what I think happens is often, and again, this is a stereotype, but this is what I see in my office. Often the wife comes in and they're talking and they're saying, I just want to know what you're thinking. And so they might approach him at home and say, what are you thinking, dear? And the response is going to be,
nothing.
Oh, nothing. It's not nothing. There's something there. He just doesn't want to talk about it.
Or the other thing that I could maybe picture is that his thoughts are he's just lost in thought. He's not thinking about anything in particular. His thoughts are just wandering, and he couldn't give a conclusive answer.
But that's not nothing. That's something.
Yeah.
And so I disagree with the idea that there's a nothing box.
Yeah.
I think there's a something box that maybe is, I like what you just said.
Yeah.
That it's probably often difficult for men to untangle what's going on. So this is my own experience, although I'm getting better at it after 45 years of marriage. When we had a disagreement, for me to figure out what was going on with myself usually took at least until the next day.
Yep.
And then I had some clarity.
Yeah.
And so I think that it goes back to, it could be, cultural, it could be the structural differences in the brain as far as being able to verbalize and analyze emotions. But I always would, the next morning, it was like, oh, okay, this is what's going on. It just took me longer. My processing time around emotions was, much slower than Lindy's. And again, I try and help couples see there's nothing wrong with that. And if we're talking about processing speed, which we all have different processing speeds, you can't change that. And you shouldn't try and change it. No. And that's one of those things that you accept, that sometimes people have different processing speeds. But I just wanted to make that comment about the nothing box, because I don't think that's accurate the way he's portraying it. I think it's more either what you said, I don't quite understand what I'm thinking about, or I don't know how to unravel it. But often it's, I don't want to talk about it with you.
Which is fair. And maybe that's why it bothers women so much, is because we want that emotional connection.
You want that information.
Yes. And it's not that women are necessarily being nosy or naggy or nitpicky. It's just they want to understand. And, when you were talking about how women often say, I just want to know what he's thinking and he doesn't have any emotions and I want to feel more connected, I would imagine that men feel akin to teaching a fish to fly. I mean, they have no idea. I mean, connected. What do you mean connected?
I have guys who say that, not the fish part, but the part of, I don't know what she means.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what we do in the office is we teach them what she means. Now, what I have heard from many, many women is that desire to know the emotional state of their spouse is mostly about safety. And the more they know, the more, if they know where their spouse is emotionally, and really often it doesn't matter where that is, they just want to know because it gives them a sense of safety.
Yes, that totally makes sense. And so my parents had a very, very rocky marriage for my entire childhood growing up. And 30 years, they're still going strong. So, I think there's something to be said about, if you work at it, you can make a relationship work. But, my parents, I would not at all call their marriage stable throughout my childhood. And that, for me, brought into my own marriage a lot of insecurities. I carried this deep insecurity that Curtis would become apathetic with me, or that he would basically just stay with me out of obligation or because of the kids. And it took me a long time to overcome that insecurity. And I think a lot of it had to do with what you said there is, Curtis, he wasn't great at sharing his emotion. And it's not that that really frustrated me. I think it just gave me a sense of insecurity of, is he going to stop loving me? Was a big fear.
Right. But the example you brought up is really important, because being silent often is misunderstood as I don't care.
Right. Oh,
Of apathy. But the thing to remember is there's something going on in the male's brain. You just have to be able to create the context in which it's easier for him to come out. Now, that both parties have a part to play. One is, for the male, have a better vocabulary, be more insightful, and then be willing to share it. And for the female, it's to not be critical. Gottman's research shows that, statistically speaking anyway, females tend to be more critical. And often it's when they hear something from their spouse they don't like, the tendency to criticize is there, which then shuts the other person down. So, the female's part is to be open, understanding, validating, all of those things. And so if you have both of the man and the woman doing those parts, then you have this expression of emotion and this sharing. And actually, the men who learn to do this feel much better about themselves and about the relationship.
Yes, and I think that there's something to be said about both genders learning to implement traits of the other, if that makes sense. I think women could really benefit from learning to compartmentalize a little bit, particularly when they're in a heightened sense of emotion. I think it's very easy for us women, when we're feeling a lot of emotions at once, it's very easy to jump around from this subject to this subject to this subject, and you're trying to get a point across, and your husband might be like, whoa, what in the world is going on here? And I also think that, men could also benefit from being less compartmentalized and from being more connected.
Right. And I agree with that, except here's where I think that one thing that you might be missing. When women went out into the workforce the way they do, they had to learn that male way of thinking.
Okay.
And so my experience with women is they're the ones that are actually able to move between the two.
Okay.
That's especially true for women in the workforce, because they have to do that. And it's men that typically have trouble. They think that linear way of thinking, they need to stay there. And they're the ones, at least from my experience, who have to learn how to move into, we'll call it that, more female realm.
Okay. Yeah.
I think more women are able to move between the two.
Yeah, I think maybe women are just, again, they're better at being non-linear. And I think also we're also much better at multitasking.
Right, but they can be linear at times.
Yeah, women can be, we can be linear.
Right, think with your kids. There are times when you're going to be both nonlinear in the emotional sense, and there are times when you're going to be linear with them, right?
Yeah.
And men, the only thing that forces them into that nonlinear realm is their relationship with their wife.
Yeah, I guess I can totally see that. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine that from a woman's perspective, because, I only know the way men interact with me. Yeah. I don't see the way men interact when women aren't around. And I think that's genuinely
in a linear way. I'm pretty certain.
Yeah, and I think it's genuinely different. I think men genuinely act different when there are no women around. And whereas women, that's not the case. We act pretty much the same whether or not men are around.
No, I think that's true. I agree with you.
Yeah. So I think really what it comes down to is empathy.
Yes.
Which is what we're going to get into next week. So, I think
it's acceptance of differences.
Yes.
And I think, one of the takeaways is really, I believe that men can learn how to do this. I believe that men can learn how to access their emotions and to be more verbal about them. There is nothing structural in their brain that prevents them from doing that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think women can learn to be accepting of men
Yes.
and of their process. I think you really hit the nail on the head there, that men process things differently. Well, everyone processes things differently. And you have to be accepting that people are who they are. You can ask them to make changes, or you can say, hey, I would like to do things differently. But at the end of the day, you're going to be so much happier if you can just accept a person as they are and choose to love them as they are. All right, so we will see everyone here next week for empathy, and I hope y'all have a good week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.